This is Living Catholic with Father Don Wolf. Living Catholic is a fresh look at issues confronting each of us today. This show deals with living out the Catholic faith, what that means for Catholics, as well as the impact on the rest of society. You certainly don't have to be Catholic to enjoy this show. And now, your host, Father Don Wolf.
Welcome, Oklahoma, to Living Catholic. I'm Father Don Wolf, pastor of Sacred Heart Parish and rector of the Shrine of Blessed Stanley Rother. I heard a comedian on YouTube the other day who was doing her stand-up routine in a club. It was just a short clip, the one I saw, so I didn't hear the entire set, but it was an interesting minute or so. She interacts with the audience rather than simply moving through her scripted jokes, which means she's not only funny, but she's quick on her feet, and she knows how to read an audience, which also means, as a basic barometer of the culture, she's priceless. She knows what people are thinking, what they're expecting, what the basic feeling sense of those who make up her audience really are, compared, say, with what we're supposed to think or what we're supposed to say. And she knows how to get a laugh. Jokes are transgressive and counter-narrational, while being at the same time part of current thought and understanding. I mean, a joke is funny because it leads you to presume one thing and then surprises you with another. It tricks you into seeing or hearing something you didn't expect, which means it leads you on with one expectation but then delivers something else. The psychologist Carl Jung had the joker or the trickster as one of the archetypes of humanity. This character describes a pattern of behavior we recognize as one of the options for how to structure our experience and cultivate our expectations. This character, as a pattern of behavior, is in every society throughout all history. Ironically, this is also one of the places where he, Carl Jung, places the archetype of the priest. The joker and the priest go together. And it's not because he thought priests and comedians were good at fooling people, or that priestly activity is to trick someone into believing something. The priest and the joker are alike because they are the ones who reveal what is hidden. The priest can pull back the curtain to reveal the holy present in the secular. The joker who is the one who reveals that there is another way of seeing. Both reveal what the careful eye might notice but doesn't usually. In fact, the successful comedian knows exactly how to run along the fine line of what's acceptable and what's unacceptable, which means he's able to bring us all into a seeing what we hadn't thought of before, but that we can still accept, especially if we can laugh at it. If he were to make a joke we all groaned at because it was too gross or too full of unacceptable thoughts, he wouldn't last long on the stage, which is why a lot of the cutting-edge comics have routines that go out of style. What we view as unacceptable doesn't remain the same. What used to be unsayable except through laughter now becomes a headline in the New York Times. What was once viewed as perfectly acceptable can become literally unsayable in our day. Making a living, making people laugh, means the comedian knows where the line is, knows where to make his living in the territory just at the border of appropriateness and scandal. He can keep one foot on each side as long as he remembers where he's standing. Priests can do the same thing. We don't make people laugh, but we stand in between the sacred and the secular and bridge the gap for everybody. Like comics, we're exploring the borderline. Except for us, it's between the divine and the mortal, between the holy and the unholy. Our job is to stand on the border with one foot on each side and invite everyone to find what we've found, to reveal the holy in places we haven't found it before, and to reveal the presence of God in ways it has not been imagined before. Priests also have to be aware that experience, language, and expectations all shift. What we imagine to be an amazing revelation in one generation becomes quotidian in another. That which has been known and experienced by everyone at one time can become a fabulous new insight at another time, which is a way of saying that priesthood is a quest and a work, a process of exploration and insight and revelation, not just a script to read or a role to act out. Walking on the border is always something risky. Priests do it all the time. In fact, we could describe Blessed Stanley Rother's life just that way. He walked on the borderline and revealed holiness where others couldn't see it. My favorite of the lines he wrote, describes this perfectly. He was once asked if he was involved in politics. The question, of course, was directed to the criticism that churchmen shouldn't be involved in the grimy political questions of everyday society. This was a question seeking to clarify whether his priesthood was sufficiently unstained by the complications of messy political life. He was also asked in order to clarify whether he might have deserved the treatment that he got in his village at the hand of the government. His response was priceless. He wrote, quote, "In Guatemala, to shake the hand of an Indian is a political act," unquote. It was perfect. Politics is something so much larger than the question that the answer blows the hinges off of the options. It was a great priestly answer. Comedians are some of the ones that we need to listen to if we want to know where our world is going and where it is. They get laughs because they expose the currents running underneath the language and experience of society. Many times they expose these currents even to the people who are moved by them. People laugh because they're surprised by what the comedian says, but they recognize when he says it that it's true. They're surprised but not shocked. The great comedians get people to walk out laughing because they hadn't heard those jokes before, but at the same time are confident they really were thinking those things all along. Jokers pull back the curtains to show people what's already there. If we want to know what's already there, then we do well to listen to what makes people laugh and those who make them laugh. I might make the case that the same is true of great preaching, but that's much less likely to be excerpted on YouTube. Well, this comedian was performing at a club, and she turned to the audience to ask a question. And for some reason, one of the persons in the audience, in explaining himself, admitted that he had become a Christian. There was a pause, and she said, "Intentionally? You became a Christian as an adult intentionally?" And then someone else in the audience said in a muffled voice, which the comedian then repeated, "High level of difficulty, finding faith as a grown-up." And everyone laughed. It's hard to communicate just how hilarious it was at the moment, since there's nothing there in the words on paper that makes it all that particularly funny. That's not unusual. Imagine reading a transcript of Robin Williams being on stage for an evening. It couldn't communicate the tone, the register, the comprehensive nature of just what makes the whole thing so funny. But it is funny. Everything would be there except the fun. But everyone laughed along with the comedian, and that's what we have to pay attention to. At the risk of doing the worst thing that can ever be done to a comedy performance, we should analyze the joke. After all, she's talking out loud about us to a group of people who thinks like she does. She's dissecting exactly what the world thinks of what we say and do. And while we are not to be conformed to this world, says St. Paul, it makes a difference when we know what the world thinks about what we say and what we do. Even St. Paul had to register how the philosophers in Athens responded to his preaching about Jesus and the resurrection. If we want to know our audience, we have to listen to the comedians. They know who they're talking to. And the first thing to note is that a life of faith is regarded as a heritage rather than a choice. Now, that's not bad. We Catholics are enthusiastic about sharing our heritage of faith with those who come after us from the earliest age. We invest, as a matter of fact, an enormous amount of energy and resources to make sure we pass on what we believe with those who come after us. And we do so from those people's earliest years. Teach kids in the way you want them to go, and they go in the direction they're sent. At least that's the wisdom that we have received from our ancestors, and they were mostly right. There's nothing faulty about preparing the coming generation and entrusting them with the faith we received. But in the club at this performance, it was filled with those who regard faith as something with no other content than what a child has received. It's the product of what your parents do and what they decide, and nothing much more. Again, it's not a false assessment, and it's true to a large extent all over. A person confesses that he's a Catholic or a Baptist or a Jew because that's how he was raised. For some, this is a confession of heritage and history and becomes a badge worn with honor and pride. And sometimes it's a description admitted to with a note of shame, depending on the current opinion about such groups. But the confession is to describe what the person is for weal or woe. I'm a Catholic means how I was born, the way I was raised, the values I inherited, the common experience I've had, and the vocabulary I'm familiar with. It's common to add something else like, I was an altar boy, to spice up the mix or at least explain a bit more of what this identification means. More than anything, it's an expansion of the meaning of what kind of family the person came from. This is what I got, might be a good way of putting it as any other. And in our day and time, it has become more and more common for a person to say, I was raised a Catholic. It's a true statement, and it implies all the meanings that we've described, but it also means something more. By describing herself this way, a person removes herself from the present. She did receive this heritage as part of her childhood, but it no longer applies as an active part of her life. Raised a Catholic means something like, I used to be a Cowboys fan. It's an admission. It explains a part of life and perhaps a particular point of view, but it's not operative now. Faith and its practice, they belong to childhood. There's no other place for them. Clearly, that's the expectation of those in the club the comedian was performing in. No one can choose the way they were raised, so they're not responsible for the content of their raising or the extent of the heritage they received. But now, as adults, they're not bound by the limitations or the specifics of their childhood, and so have superseded them. This was the content of a quite offensive book published by Peter Occhiogrosso about 20 years ago called Once a Catholic. It's a collection of the confessions of adults about what they experienced of their faith as children and young adults, and how they eventually grew out of the presumptions and limitations of the faith so as to embrace leaving the church. The general theme mentioned over and over in the stories told there in that book is that no one would be a Catholic by choice, but only by heritage. In the most charitable version of this, these individuals admitted it was fine for them as children. They just couldn't match up to their lives as adults. In the less than charitable versions, they were offended by what they had to learn or practice by being raised a Catholic. It's a hard book to read, as much for the self-absorption of the people telling the story as for the staggering ignorance of what the church is and teaches. Which leads to the other aspect of the presumption so evident in this comedian's performance, and it's the notion that faith can only be the provenance of a child. It's not anything worthy of or available as an adult, at least not as our kind of adult, the normal, decent kind of person stumbling through the pathways of life like the rest of us. Adults don't believe these kind of things about sin, forgiveness, healing, happiness, and heaven. That's for kids. So to have someone admit out loud he has become a Christian as an adult, to embrace its teachings and acknowledge the presence of Christ in his life, comes as a shock to these folks. I have no doubt it would be the same response if someone were to say he was a serious Catholic, someone who has taken what he has received seriously and conformed his life to the life of faith in Christ. It's something just not done in our world. There's no place for such things in the lives of these ordinary people who came to listen to a comedian and enjoy their Saturday night. And that they can laugh together as someone makes fun of the idea of faith as an adult solidifies them in their attitude and their point of view. We all know what they're saying, together with their laughter. This kind of thing is unusual and truly odd, an adult becoming a Christian. I suppose it's something else we should get used to, I more than anyone else. The church has been my life, most of my life, and I can't imagine it not being at the center of my concern. From the time I was a child, what was going on in church mattered to me. When I went to college the first weekend, I found a phone book and looked up the address of the university chapel, called to find out what the mass times were, and then walked over there on Saturday evening to see how long it would take to get there, so I'd know exactly where it was. It mattered to me because it was important to the concourse of my life, and I think most especially because I was away from home for the first time. I didn't have the props and support of those around me like I always had before. I can't imagine simply dismissing a life of faith as meaningless or purposeless. It's important for me to hear from those whom this experience is not the default position of their lives, because it's not the kind of life I have. If I'm going to speak to the world, I need to know about what those people think. Just recently, there was a lot of news about a Jeopardy question asked of the contestants on the TV program. The clue was, In the prayer Jesus gave to the apostles, it goes, "Our Father who art in heaven, blank be thy name." Not one of the contestants could answer. No one there knew how to complete the first sentence of the Our Father. It's almost impossible to imagine, and yet there it is. This is our world. A huge section of it cannot imagine there is any place in it for faith. It's not without its admirers, of course. The philosopher Sam Harris published his little book a couple of years ago called The End of Faith. It's a version of a book that's been written in every generation for the last 300 years. But it's taken on a special meaning in our day and time because it leverages this new interest in the lapse of belief in our society. In it, he simply describes that since no one believes in religion anymore, we need to get busy and get on with our lives free from the impediments of belief, as well as being free from the anxiety about not believing. Now, I think at this point we're way beyond worrying about what it might mean if we don't believe. The folks at the club listening to their favorite comic weren't worried when she presumed no real adult would live the life of faith by choice. I have a cousin who fits comfortably into this category. She was raised a Catholic by a very pious mother and father. All her education was at Catholic schools until she went to college. There she began to meet people and to move up in the career path she had chosen. And after a stint of working around here, she moved on to Washington, D.C. Over the course of time, she became more and more comfortable not practicing the faith, more and more comfortable of identifying herself as having been raised Catholic as a description of her past. She now calls herself a Buddhist, not the kind that regards all things as illusion and strives to overcome the passions of life so as to be free of illusion, but the kind of Buddhist that maintains we're all basically striving to do something spiritual with our lives, whatever that's supposed to mean. Catholicism and belief in God, now there's something she's gotten over. It's interesting that the comment from the audience, amplified by the comedian, was also about behavior. That is, to be an adult Christian who embraces the faith means, in their understanding, you act in a particular way. And that expectation is all to the good. We want the whole world to know those who believe in Christ are bound to a moral code of behavior that blesses the whole world and enlivens the one who embraces it. It's a relief to know the average person understands believing has something to do with deciding and acting. To believe is to be set apart on the stage of behavior, not just by what's professed or what the affixed label might be. It has to do with something about how we act. And the world knows this. If we had the chance to probe a bit, I'm sure we'd find they're talking about sexual ethics, or at least I hope they are. No one is that much exercised about Christian virtues like telling the truth or honoring a contract or recognizing authority, all aspects of a developed moral life. And there aren't many people who think of morality as including genuine concern for the poor, whose needs must be recognized and responded to. Most people, when they think about behavior, mostly think about Christians as those who have some anxiety about sex. So to embrace Christian belief as an adult is all the more difficult because it means you actually know what you're giving up and what you're embracing in the sexual realm. In our world, this means the wide landscape of sexual behavior is fenced in and the large palette of options and combinations concerning sexuality is reduced. So when the voice in the audience said, high level of difficulty, finding faith as a grown-up, he didn't mean it was difficult to embrace the lordship of Jesus Christ as the Son of God. He meant you've seen the options for sex and relationship and you've chosen what is narrow and restricted. And that's actually positive too. I'm glad the whole world leans in such a direction with their opinion. Now notice, in this short bit of comedy, nobody condemned the faith. There was no one who stood up and criticized the resurrection or the claims of the Nicene Creed. Nobody made fun of the Pope or made as if the priesthood were illegitimate. In fact, no one said anything derogatory about what Christians believe or what they do. It's not like it. It's not like anyone is bashing religious people at all. It's simply understood at this point in our society that normal people just don't act this way. That is, that normal people don't believe. If religion exists at all, it's a stubborn remnant of those days as a child in which we're not responsible for what we believe or for giving the reasons why we act. Tackling this point of view, that this notion that no normal person would believe these things, tackling that point of view is a lot more difficult than rooting out error or correcting mistakes, which means there has to be an entirely new way of thinking about and looking at the world for us. And that means we have to do a lot of things differently. For the last several years, I've been responding to people who listen to Catholic radio. People who listen to this program tend to be those who spend a lot of time listening to the content of the many programs Catholic radio puts on in the course of a day. Most of those programs are question and answer. The host opens up the phone lines, people call in with their questions. Whatever's missing or confused is straightened out, and we get to overhear. It's a clever way to teach, and those programs have been very successful. I can't imagine that there had been such a program on the radio available for everybody to listen to 30 or 40 years ago. But those programs are with us now. But in the midst of my enthusiasm for them, I have only one critique, and it's this. Most people don't have questions. It's good to answer what people ask. Our greatest challenge, though, is to address those people for whom it has never occurred to them that there might be a question. So we should take this comedy for what it is. It's a window onto the world we live in and participate in every day. If we go to the pulpit or talk with a person across the driveway or even start talking to somebody in the family at the cookout in the backyard, we might remember that chances are they're the ones at the club laughing at the jokes of this comedian. The life of adult faith is as strange to imagine in any realistic scenario for life for them as wearing a tuxedo to a pool party or a pair of galoshes to a dance. When we talk to them, we have to remember this. It means we have to be smart. It's simply what it means to proclaim the gospel in our time. We can also learn from this same comedian. Over and over, in other jokes in her routine, she speaks of her ruinous relationships, her frustrated potential, her terrible choices, and her inability to do what she knows is right for her, even when she knows it's right. And everybody laughs with her when she describes those things because her life is our lives. It might not be a bad place to begin if we want to talk about a new life in Christ, free from the power of sin and the stain of remorse or regret or shame. Who knows? To proclaim Jesus risen from the dead to those who laugh at the death of their own hopes and joke at the darkness of their own choices might be a good beginning. Who knows where it might lead? I suppose we could just ask a comedian. Back in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment, Faith in Verse. We have a poem today called Black and White Photos in the Meeting Room. I read the stories of their settled lives, these men, the heroes of the past. With somber equanimity, they pushed onto the frontier to build what would last. They, of firm belief, seemed never to have a doubt or scarcely a care. From the viewpoint of today, the troubles of yesterday seem a joke to them, a dare. And I marvel at all they did, in the heavy overcoats and linen collars they wore, in the black and white world we see as we gaze into their fierceness at the fore. Doubt and anxieties seemed hardly to matter in the settled world they strove to build, with the lack of the moment only the vacuum left by their striving to open and fill. Were they so, the heroes of the past who braved the chills of their pastoring and prayers, unwavering in their faithfulness from a foundation of which we are unaware? Or do they benefit only from the faulty vision we bring as we look from our distance, that no matter the stolidness they embody, they would look at their ease askance? They were but men, and we proclaim that their souls, like ours, are divinely made. Each one touches the grime of doubt and the stain of sin to flower in the shade. No matter their heroism, they were heroic indeed. The church did grow here. We are those who inherited what they made. It is ours to hold and value dear. For they in their collars and coats from so long ago are but truly us, and we are but them as we live under the umbrella of time and the piers of trust. That's Black and White Photos in the Meeting Room. To proclaim the gospel, that is the work that we all have, and to proclaim the gospel amidst the places where we live, that is our missionary work every day. I hope that in the weeks to come you can join us here at Living Catholic. Hope to see you then.
Living Catholic is a production of Oklahoma Catholic Radio. To learn more, visit okcr.org.